Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Doomer Optimism. Today I am joined by the famous Tornado Nathan Gates, not related to Bill. And he's going to be my co-host today on this discussion about distributism. And our guests are Chris Smaje, who you all know well, the author of A Small Farm Future, and Sean Domenic. I'm saying your name wrong.
Domencic. It's a
Domencic.
common mistake. I've heard
Yeah.
it every which way.
Okay. Domencic. And first, I'm going to have Nate introduce himself since he is a first-time host and guest. He's going to be first time on Doomer Optimism. After that, I'll have Sean introduce himself briefly. You all know Chris, so we'll skip that, and then we'll get started in the discussion. So, Nate, you go first.
Hi, I'm Nathan Gates, and I am a psychotherapist and farmer in rural West Central Illinois. I've been here for about a decade. I'm coming up on my decade of being a self-employed therapist, and a decade being sort of a homesteader. We've come a long way in that decade. It's quite a journey. We've learned a lot about homesteading. For the last 5 years, we have started a cattle herd and are working at farming and actually learning about cattle and learning about pastures. And it's a family project. I have two boys, 12 and 14, who are, a lot of help and really eager to learn. So it's a great way to raise kids. I think it's a wonderful experience for them. And we also homeschool as well. Emily's at home with them and does the homeschooling, and I bring in most of our income off farm, but we're working to level up our farm operation here over the next couple of years. And so, yeah, we're in the thick of that. We're also really in the middle of West Central Illinois, so we're in the middle of corn and bean country, which is interesting. And it's I think it's a unique environment. It's a unique environment to homestead in. It's a unique environment to do a smaller farm in, because we're really in the middle of everything around us is just huge. The farming at scale, like everything's 16-row combines, $500,000 machines. Farmers are small if they farm 2,500 acres. And the big ones farm over 10. It's unbelievable. And so it's just an industrial zone in the spring and the fall. Pretty amazing to see and be in the middle of. So that informs my perspective a lot, just seeing that and being surrounded by that and seeing how absolutely colonized places are when they can be colonized in that way. Like if it's flat and has relatively fertile soil, it's remarkable to see.
Yep. Yeah. All right, cool. Sean, you can introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you. And of course, thanks for having me on as well. It's been a while since we've spoken. So so my name is Sean Domencic. I am a member of the Catholic Worker Movement in the U.S. Here in Lancaster, PA, Amish country. In addition, I am the director of Tradistae, which is a project which includes a now retired podcast, a website, and a sort of network of friends inspired by the Catholic Worker Movement, as well as a contributing author for New Polity, which is kind of in the vein of post-liberal thought. I think in terms of the conversations around, permaculture and doomer optimism and such, I've found there's a lot of resonance between a lot of conversations that have been happening independently in Catholic circles. And so I've been really interested. And I think Chris and I have had some great conversations in bringing those worlds together. So look forward to continuing that.
Cool. Awesome. So one thing that's like really on my mind lately is thinking about building these coalitions of people who like agree on what we need to be moving toward. So a little bit of background, my dissertation, I spoke with a lot of people who were small scale food producers, and like the reasons they got into it were all over the map. Like they were so politically different from one another. But they all kind of came to this similar conclusion, and then found ways to work together with one another and make friendships and coalitions and all this. So I don't know, maybe I'll start with asking Chris to describe briefly the idea of distributism, and maybe a brief laying out of the different political, the ideologies that are drawn to something like this or why they might be. And then we could just all kind of jump in on that topic, because I think that'll be the main thing we discuss today. Oh, and I just want to briefly say, if I didn't already, that Chris will have an article on distributism coming out in the Land magazine sometime in the future. We don't know when. So Chris, why don't you get us started?
Sure. And probably worth mentioning also that we've been discussing, building something of a sort of new distributist movement and a distributist sort of congress, like bringing people together. So it's it's kind of in the in the ether. I must admit, I feel a little bit of an imposter here, especially with Sean sitting in on this conversation. I kind of feel like I'm kind of an accidental distributist. In fact, Sean got in touch with me after reading my book, and I think you said somewhere that it's kind of like it's like the best outline of sort of modern distributism you've seen. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess it is. I hadn't really thought of that. And I much less than Sean am I sort of steeped in that whole tradition of distributism and its religious roots and the Catholic worker movement. But it's been really interesting talking with him about these issues, and also, as you were saying, actually just engaging with people sort of building local farming, local employment, local community, and that in a sense is more important than the sort of bigger politics that might divide us. But I mean, I guess my take on distributism, and I'm sure Sean will jump in if to clarify or contradict, but I mean, it kind of emerged in England, where I am, in the early 20th century, associated with writers like G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc. And it was kind of, I mean, at that time you had this, just emerging from this kind of Victorian turbo-capitalist sort of industrialization and, laissez-faire economics and sort of global imperial conquest, just real sort of rapacious capitalism. And on the other hand, you had the socialism developing, which, so very much a collectivist movement based on sort of disciplined industrial labor. And in a sense, they, people often think of socialism or communism as being the sort of antithesis of capitalism, but in many ways they're quite similar. They're kind of industrial, organized collectivist economic modalities. And the interesting thing to me about distributism was that it kind of interpolated between those. It was basically an argument for localism, for people to be able to generate livelihoods, autonomous livelihoods for people to be engaged in sort of honest trades, for people to have access to local land to produce food and livelihood for themselves. And basically I've come to it, my background sort of originally was in sort of traditional left wing, and I studied anthropology and social science. My teachers, who were great thinkers in many ways, but came from a sort of Marxist background. And there's this whole that whole tradition, which in some ways is part of a longer tradition of romanticism, which again is to sort of become a dirty word, that a kind of a critique of the kind of mass scale accumulative industrial mindset. So that sort of tradition, people in England, people like William Morris, John Ruskin, emerge earlier thinkers like Blake or William Cobbett, and so on. And it links. It's so difficult, these political conversations, because everything links to everything else in complex ways. There's a tradition of republicanism, which we might get onto. I saw one of the comments on Twitter earlier asked about Thomas Jefferson. So there's all sorts of interesting crossovers. But essentially, there is this pretty kind of hidden and buried tradition that the sort of politics of the early 20th century, which we're still seeing now in my recent engagement arguing with sort of eco-modernists, where there's that, there's still that kind of industrial mass scale mindset, which, has its manifestations both on the traditional left and the traditional right. And so this is a kind of really interesting tradition that, has been, relatively new to me in thinking about local livelihoods. I've come to it from an agrarian and an environmentalist point of view. How do we create decent livelihoods for people without destroying, destroying the planet, destroying the ecosystems? So, local livelihoods sort of have based around household, based around decent work, based around trying to, the politics and the economics is, subsidiarity is an important word perhaps that we'll get onto. So sort of trying to make decisions at the lowest and most local, the smallest level possible, giving people autonomy to, to sort of generate life and livelihood and community, autonomously sort of within community. I'll probably stop at that point and see, get some reactions.
I wonder, yeah, I'll let Sean jump in now, give us maybe a little bit more depth or the Catholic perspective too.
Yeah, well, and I'll say first off, Chris, we're really all the imposters here, due to the fact that we're all Americans, in some form or another. So you've got the real ethnic roots of distributism. But yeah, no, I mean, one phrase that's commonly used, in a lot of distributist way as just like a simple explainer is that, in capitalism, you have the means of production, right? Productive private property owned by a very small number of private individuals, the billionaire class as we would, have it today. And under socialism, at least in the sort of, Marxist state socialist, USSR type projects, you have the same. You have the means of production owned by a very small number of individuals who are the state bureaucrats, the public persons, rather than the private. Distributism proposes, and I think this is often what I give as like the most basic definition, is the idea of as widely distributed private property as possible. That actually everyone has, a genuine sort of stake and share in property. And so I think this, like Chris was saying, it sort of breaks the mold of that traditional left-right discourse and dichotomy. And you were asking Ashley about sort of ideologies that approach it. And I think, and this could be an interesting conversation we could go more into, is that I think anarchism, like anarcho-communism stuff has often been the closest at trying to get in that direction, in the sense that, proposes a sort of widespread, universal project of liberation, and is also opposed to like the bureaucratic. I'm thinking of Kropotkin here, who was very influential on Peter Marin, one of the founders of the Catholic worker movement. And so he was very critical of the Soviet Union and its kind of bureaucratic socialism and its industrialism and such. But the difference is that distributism, again, like even that, like where I say that's maybe like the closest sort of nodding towards it, it doesn't really fit into that mold because it's in sort of distributist thought, property is a good thing. It's not something to be eliminated or avoided or an evil thing to be done away with, as most communist theory has it. And likewise, government too. That's another thing that in sort of, and Chris and I have had some discussions in this vein on his blog, but the idea of governments being essentially evil in anarchist thought and needing to happen, if at all, through like sort of totally voluntary structures that are created. I think distributism sees both governance and property as being something that can be genuinely good when they're rightly ordered, when they're kept in that subsidiary way where all that can happen on the lowest levels does happen there, and it doesn't all get sort of concentrated into this totalitarian structures that we have today on both the left and the right. So that I think is just things I would add to what Chris has said, and very much in agreement with that description. And yeah, as far as the Catholic tradition, I mean, I'll definitely note I think something we'll probably get into, and I saw this also on the Twitter questions, about, how applicable is it, outside of Catholicism or Christianity and such. And I think that's a really interesting point to get into. But it definitely does have roots there in the sense that a lot of it draws from a lot of medieval thinking. So, when that was happening, that turn of the century hyper capitalism that was going on, there were some people that sort of looked to the Enlightenment and said, how can we use the Enlightenment against itself? How can we use the Enlightenment to transcend it? And that's essentially the Marxist project, to take the sort of categories of modern enlightened thinking and try to push them beyond liberal capitalism, which was the product of the Enlightenment. But then there was also this romantic reaction, right? And the romantic reaction said, no, we have to still retain this connection with our roots, with our past, and find some way to apply it. And the application isn't just going to be, and this is an important point I think we could also get into, is that application isn't just this kind of like reactionary call to order, but is a genuinely kind of renewal of these old concepts in a way that it has radical potentials in our current social order. And so I think that's what thinkers like John Ruskin were doing. And that he didn't use the word distributism, but I would kind of consider him a proto-distributist. A lot of socialists like to claim him, but he actually distanced himself from that word. And he was read, there's a direct link between him and Chesterton and such. And even he was a socialist, but William Morris, the sort of agrarian socialism that was very opposed to the sort of industrial technocratic socialism of Bellamy and such. So I think that there's, that kind of romantic background has always been interested in taking, that tradition and offering some kind of radical critique that's grounded in tradition. And so that's where, the reason that it was, and it is so related to a lot of Catholic thought is that's very much in line with the way that a lot of Catholics have thought about social issues. So Catholic social teaching, for those not familiar, is the popes of the Catholic Church have actually since the Enlightenment really, and particularly since the fall of the Papal States, there's kind of been this reevaluation of the church and its relationship to the world, with all the sort of medieval pomp and circumstance that the church could still enjoy even late into modernity wiped away. And that's been similarly in that vein. So Pope Leo the 13th issued Rerum Novarum, and that's actually where the call for widespread private property comes explicitly from, the Pope of the Catholic Church, and that was in 1891. So it was read by a lot of Catholics, and it was drawing from a lot of those medieval traditions that Ruskin and Morris were also drawing from, in the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas and a lot of other things. And so, that is a continuing tradition. There's been more encyclicals. Some people, even in the environmentalist permaculture world, will be familiar with Pope Francis's environmental emphasis, and that's largely taken the place of this encyclical Laudato Si, which is just one of many. Like since that Rerum Novarum in 1891, there's been dozens and dozens of social encyclicals that have kind of brought to bear Christian and Catholic thinking on social questions, political questions. And they've been constant in their sort of affirmation of a lot of these concepts of subsidiarity, of distributed ownership. I know even Schumacher in his Small is Beautiful, he makes a specific reference to, and he of course had the Catholic connection, but he makes a specific reference to those encyclicals and how the popes have been really active. I think he says something early in the book about how like there's no greater defender of the dignity of work than the Roman pontiffs. And he's referencing how there's a constant critique in that teaching against the sort of mechanization of work. And especially the key phrase is work being turned into a mere means and a mere commodity to something rather than something that is actually for humans, for, ennobling us, dignifying us, providing us with the goods that we need. So that's maybe a broad connection of why it's such a big thought. And of course, the towering figure of Chesterton, who's known by some not even for his political thought, but as a literary figure, his name's widely known, and he was obviously very Catholic, and very vocally so, and part of sort of the apologetical tradition there. So yeah, I think that's a general intro. I mean, a lot more could be said, but
yeah,
that
we'll dig into those things. But I want to let Nate go. See if you have a question. I'm actually like thinking about at the moment all the different people who are mad at me and dislike me. So you talking about communism, I got people calling me a communist. Every time we're mentioning something, I'm thinking about people using this clip to call me some name. So I'm really glad we're using like all the words that everybody is ready to jump on and call doomer optimism something. So Nate, you go.
Wow, there's a lot. So I'll try to like feel my way into this conversation. I don't know much, right? So in a way, I think that hopefully that'll help be kind of a stand-in for a lot of people for whom this may be new to. I'm been interested before in distributism, but I mean, to be honest, I kind of like years ago wrote it off as like, well, yeah, it's this niche thing that's kind of cool. I mean, I thought it was cool, but I never really thought much more about it. But, I think as I've gotten older and things in my mind seem a lot more dire, and things just seem so deadlocked on this left-right axis. And there's just no possibility for sort of creative generativity there right now, it doesn't seem to me. And also then looking into the future and the amount of uncertainty, I think, having a real open mind about other ways of looking at things. And so I've been more curious about this. And so I'm learning at the moment, and at the recommendation of some Twitter peeps have been, reading Chesterton, who, among other things, is hilarious to read. I mean, the man is a funny writer. And cutting in a beautiful way. So I haven't gotten very far in, but he's a very enjoyable read. And so that's where I'm coming from. And I as far as formulating a question, I really enjoy the emphasis on private property. I think is I appreciate that a lot, because I think when you own something, you're highly motivated to care for it, and there's a stewardship that goes with that, especially when there's some continuity. I think a lot about, it's not very often you think in a lot of contexts in the modern world about like building things that you're gonna that you want to see grow over generations. I think about that, with the farm, and about like, okay, I could hand this off. Hopefully, my kids could run with this. And, we planted a lot of trees this spring, and that's something you have to think on a time scale that, is just so much longer than I think we normally do. And to me, private property kind of almost helps with, you feel some ownership over, what's going to happen to this place over time, and what can I do to promote that. And then, so I guess I mentioned that I live in West Central Illinois. And so I think about distributed private property, and then I think about like the opposite of that, which is where I live. Like a country block, which is, like a few mile, block on the country roads. You can look and you can see the shell of like tons of homesteads. Those are just the ones that still have a rotting shell. Like most of them are like have been leveled and plowed over, but like there may be on this block, like, supported 10, 12 families at some point, who would live, off the land. And now it's probably farmed by one or two farmers. And then there's the margins where there's some wood, and there's a little bit of wildlife in the margins perhaps, but if it can be plowed, it will. And so I think the distributist vision of a land populated by people is beautiful to me. Where I'm really curious is, how do we get there from here, right? Like sometimes I'm reading about that, and it feels very so theoretical. How do we get there from here? I'm interested. I'm real interested, but like, yeah, that's where I it's hard sometimes, I think, to really wrest that from my environment when you just see, thousands and thousands of acres being planted by, just, a farm. Like, how do you get to this more distributed private property?
Yeah, that's a great question. You guys jump in, and then I think we can back into the different questions about the different ideologies that line up with this as we I think about the practical would be a good way to get to it.
Yeah. Can I jump in with a couple
of
points?
Go for it.
I mean, the sort of how do we get there is is the sort of the crux question, and I mean I've sort of got drawn into debating that lately. To some extent, I think the answer is nobody knows, and anyone who claims they do know is a charlatan. And I think Sean, he mentioned Enlightenment, the kind of the modernist moment, and I think this is one of the difficulties, is that kind of modernist thinking has it's kind of got this kind of progress ideology associated with it, which has these sort of beautiful answers that are kind of wrong, and part of it is that there is some intrinsic mechanism that's gonna make life better and everyone's going to be happy, on the sort of the capitalist right. The argument has been about market discipline, let market forces decide. On the left, it's been about collective organization, class conflict, ultimately will generate a better society. And I think, for me, part of this moment is about letting go of that and saying that, we are really, those modernist dynamics have worked themselves out into the situation we now inhabit, which has led to sort of intractable problems, and nobody really has the answer. And part of the answer, I think, is about not necessarily sort of having some great scheme that we're going to unleash on the whole world that is going to make everything all right for everybody. It's about sort of engaging locally, trying to build your own livelihood and your own well-being within the context of family, household, community, society, and just sort of maybe in some ways what Ashley was saying at the beginning, just get started and do something. But I mean, one thing I did want to say about this sort of whole idea of property and work as well is, property is private property is quite a confusing thing, because I guess what it really means to me is it's actually not a kind of really private individual thing. And in fact, the whole, in some ways, the tradition of distributism, reaching back, as Sean was saying, to older types of thought, it kind of tries to break down this notion of individual versus collective as being a kind of, it's not really a useful distinction. And the individual is not prior to society, and society is instantiated in individuals. So, I mean, the idea of private property is that the community accords you as a private or individual person, or as a household, whatever, some collectivity is accorded a kind of an exclusive right to appropriate something. So it might be, land, or, access to some resource. But that doesn't mean that you can just do whatever you like, and part of the whole problem with the notion of private property is that, we have a kind of, a kind of capital, the way that capitalist economics operates with it is that you can accumulate private rights, and that's where you get the situation that you've just described, Nate, where you are. You can buy land, you can you can accumulate sort of endless property, and you end up with a very small number of people. It's like the game of Monopoly, really. It always ends up with somebody owning everything, and everyone else is scratching around, trying to get some crumbs from the table. So the distributist idea is that, there's a real critical distinction between the right to accumulate private property and the right to have access to private property, private appropriation. And there's almost a parallel in what we were saying about work, the way that people talk about work in modernist mindsets. We talk about labor, and, Marx was the sort of premier theorist of labor, and labor is this very kind of abstract quantity that you can aggregate and you can direct. It's completely different from the idea of being, a homesteader or a or a craftsman, where you can't, you don't aggregate the labor of lots and lots of smallholders and create a big grain farm. That's absolutely what it's not about. So there's an emphasis on honest work, words like work, craftsmanship, professions, maybe calling. It's very different from labor. We've got this kind of we've got into this weird modernist mindset where we almost think of labor as being a bad thing, or work as a bad thing. The less we can get labor out of agriculture, we can make it less labor intensive. But what we actually need to be doing is creating work, not aggregating labor, but creating low carbon community building work for people. And that's where the kind of this whole dynamic about private property comes in. And it's not only about private property. Again, sort of on the left, you get people often distinguishing private property from commons, but it's worth looking at old agricultural societies. It's a bit of a hobby horse of mine, this, but they always go together. People always are and again, it's the sort of subsidiarity, sorry, that where it's possible for you to generate a livelihood yourself or in your household or your family, you do that. But in certain situations, it doesn't make sense to do that, and it's often sort of relatively landscape level, extensive things like, how do you manage a woodland? How do you manage a river? People come together and figure out arrangements, often very clever and sophisticated arrangements that enables everyone to kind of get the best out of it. So that doesn't really answer your question of how the hell do we get from where we are now to that. But part of it, I think, is a kind of battle for minds. It's like even resurrecting these traditions like distributism, even talking about romanticism as if it's not a bad thing, talking about honest work as if we're not aggregating labor. Just having that kind of different mindset is it kind of feels to me we're starting from a low base and we don't have a lot of time in terms of some of the crises we're facing. But we've just having these kinds of discussions and sort of realizing not turning our back on the party, exactly as Sean was saying earlier, there's this sort of this notion that you're looking back, you're trying to turn the clock back, you want to live in some sort of oldie worldy way. That's not what it's about. It's kind of about people who figured out the difficulties of living and working together in local low energy situations. We need to kind of be inspired by those examples and sort of learn that language again. How we do that. I think my sense is that we're gonna essentially there's going to be a lot of crisis situations. There's going to be a lot of, and it's kind of interesting, again, like someone raised the issue of Jefferson, the kind of Republican tradition that this is sort of associated with in some ways, generally emerges in times of crisis when kind of big global systems are breaking down. People aren't really, governments aren't sort of generating the welfare and resources that they used to. People start casting around for, how am I going to make a living? How am I going to get food? And that's when they start looking to their local communities and also, to themselves and sort of generating a politics around, access to local land or to work or whatever it might be. So, that's the context in which I think we have to look at it, but not that there's kind of a single overarching answer to it all that, we can just kind of deliver as a sort of political manifesto. The nature of it is kind of specific, local, interactive and so on. Anyway, yeah, a few thoughts there.
I just want to add something real quick. The thing that keeps coming to mind, or the elephant in the room for me, is just like John Michael Greer, collapse now and avoid the rush kind of thinking, and just the energy like situation we're in. I mean, we're really just on, we've just been in a couple of centuries at least of ramping up industrialism to just unbelievable heights, and we're just on the far side of that now, and there's all sorts of material consequences of it, and people keep freaking out when those material consequences come home to roost, and the people like us who are on the sidelines are just like, like there are, like, oil's a finite resource, for example. Just acknowledging that fact is something that I think a lot of people don't even think to even acknowledge first, and then what are the the knock-on effects of that. The other thing that I think is really worth pointing out is what you guys were saying about work and labor, Sean and Chris. When we talk about things like the small farm future to people who are like modernist minded, a lot of people will just be like, you know, that's too much work, thinking all labor is the same, like their work in industry, or, you know, even like white collar industry is the same as like working informally on a homestead. Like those things are not the same. So people don't even really know how to think about it when you suggest that, or they just think like all work is horrible and we should avoid it at all costs. And then when you say something like distributism or small farm future, a lot of people will say like, how does it scale? And again, you're asking the same questions from a modernist mindset that will give you those same answers, which are like, everything has to be standardized, it has to scale. So when I think of somebody like George Monbiot, who's come to the eco-modernist conclusion he has, if you have those priors, those are obviously going to be your conclusions. Like it makes sense based on those priors that would be your conclusion. So you have to like ask completely different questions. It's almost like a change entirely in ontology. And I just wanted to toss that out there. I also agree about the crises. So like what we're doing right now, which is just kind of laying the groundwork for people to try to understand what the crises mean and what's behind them, and then what might be historical solutions, to me is like the most hopeful, or the most impactful thing I could do like with my life, which is why this whole project is what it is. So Sean, I wanted to let you jump in if you wanted to.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, my first thought to Nathan's question was, along the lines, I mean, as far as how we get there, there's this great book, A Small Farm Future by Chris Smaje. I highly recommend. Part 4 is really good on this topic. But no, like I do think, and you've gestured broadly at it, Chris, just of like that sort of agrarian populism, the localist politics, which is really what distributism is all about. And like you said, I think Chris has said this, Greer said it. I mean, I think that even the name doomer optimism evokes it. Like, we're going to have to do this regardless. Like I think that's kind of where a lot of us are at. What we're convinced of is that this is something that is both like a doom that awaits us. Like we are, like there's going to be some kind of general collapse and breakdown in the near future, and we're seeing a lot of early signs of it. And that's scary, what I mean? That's unfortunate. And it also kind of puts it, presses the point, like it makes it non-optional. But there's also an optimism both in the fact that because we'll have to do it, one, that means that there will be opportunities. And it also means that the more we can do now, the better we'll fare, when these breakdowns of oil, especially of water resources, of climate stability begin to really shift. But I wanted to say too about like the one size fits all solution. I think that's a really important thing in diagnosing about modernist sort of thinking, is that in general the way we approach things is that there is a sort of there's this one thing that will fix everything. And for Marxists, it's the class struggle, the eliminate private property is kind of the evil. And through class struggle, we'll have common property, the elimination of that. For liberalism, there's this sort of fixation on the individual, and our sort of selfishness, our individualism. The more we can free that from restraints, so that we can eliminate restraints, that's the evil, and have freedom, and that'll be will solve all our problems. And other forms too. I mean, with various sort of alt-right ideologies, are based around like nation and race. A fixation on, like there's a particular thing. It's, the thing is the white race, or the nation state. And, there's these particular things that are all failed. And we've seen these projects fail throughout the 20th century, at even delivering on their own promises, much less any kind of general liberation. And so I think distancing from that thinking, and even like, distributism sometimes reads as like property being that thing, property, like distributed private property being the universal panacea. And I think that's a mistake, especially because if you I think Chesterton sometimes, in his impish style of kind of trying to parody, and point out, the ironies of those he was discussing with. And a lot of his work is very discursive. Like a lot of it was for newspapers and back and forth with people. He can sometimes get in that tone, but in his more sort of theoretical moments, he's very clear, like not the solution isn't to make every parcel of land on the earth, a little distributed piece of private property. One, as Chris pointed out, private property in the Catholic tradition and the ancient tradition is not absolute in the way it is in the modern liberal Lockean sense. But also Chesterton's very clear, like we need commons and even some, elements of public property, right? Like, elements of church property, nonprofits, these sort of, organizations that exist, for these other purposes, these institutions in society. These are all important, and serve an important role. And you should have, he has a great line somewhere in Outline of Sanity where he says that what we're after is a sense of proportion, and not a sort of absolute fixation on anything, but proportionality to things. And in that way, I think that the one thing that we could say, if there is like a solution of the thing that we have to seek, I would think we could hearken to the idea of virtue as that. And that's something that Chris and I have been discussing of, and something that in a lot of certainly Chesterton's thought and a lot of post-liberal thought is this resurrection of virtue ethics, it being really important, and recognizing that virtue is not this merely private thing. A lot of us have this, kind of like Victorian sense of like virtue is maybe what you do at like the dinner table or in the bedroom, but it has nothing to do with like politics or economics or anything. And again, hearkening back to that classical sense, and Ruskin was big on this point too, is that virtue is, how you treat your workers. Virtue is how you treat the land, right? Like your relationship to the earth is part of virtue. And what virtue is ultimately having a sort of well-proportioned, well-ordered soul, having your passions, your intellect, your will rightly ordered, and going out from yourself, your relationships. Justice is one of the classical virtues in the Republic and the Socrates, Plato discourse. And justice is our that proportionality of our relationships with others. And so, and because of that because virtue, and I think the reason modernism essentially replaces all these other things with virtue, like selfishness is the virtue of liberalism, right? Revolution, or struggle sort of is the virtue of Marxism. The nation, what I mean? The hierarch, the sort of tyrant king is the virtue, is your obedience and submission to him is the only virtue of nationalism and such. And so, I think that the difficulty is, like, we can say virtue is the thing, but we have to understand that it's something broad. There's many virtues, right? And they happen on all different levels. This is where the subsidiarity comes in, is, virtue is everything from the way you relate to your hunger and, whether you, just immediately go for a snack, or whether you have the restraint, all the way up to the way that an elected ruler, distributes resources to the people, and all these things, like, and every level in between, how you're treating the land, how you're treating, you're doing economic transactions, how you're relating to family and parents, and that sort of, we were talking about the household, like that's another important point. And so there's so many things tied into that are all sort of part, this broad tradition that can't be summed up in, just a few simple dictums about how we're going to run all of society from the top to the bottom.
Yeah, I'd like to, I'd like to jump in with, I didn't with my question mean to suggest that I thought there was a one size fits all. It's more getting at, like, how do we carve out space for this to happen? Because I think there's things that actively prevent this sort of thing from happening. So it's like my thing is like, well, how do we carve out space? But I also wanted to kind of maybe give an example and see, if this sort of like fits. How we're thinking about this, and you talk about not absolute private property in the sense that we think of private property today, like this is mine, no one else's, don't tell me what the hell to do on it, versus kind of a sense that might be in a more distributist mindset. Like right now, so my nightmare scenario, right, other than climate disaster, making everybody fled from everywhere and mass starvation stuff. But my personal nightmare scenario is that somebody would buy land close to me and move in and open up a hog cafe, right? Like just like that's just like a disastrous idea. And what that would be, and within this private property, right? Like it's very hard to argue with that. Like, well, I bought this. This is mine. I live in the country. You can't stop me. And as long as I follow these federal regulations, these state regulations, which are a joke, but as long as I follow those, like you can't stop me. This is what I'm gonna do, right? And so the decision making here is like there's me, property owner, there's somebody else comes in, buys something else, right? And then it's going through this centralized power structure here of like, yep, am I checking the boxes? Yes. Do I own the land? Yes, I can do what I want. And me living a half mile and having to smell that, it's like out of luck. So like in a distributist framework, it's more like, like there is a community kind of standard for like how do we, like what are we using this land for? No, we're not going to put thousands of hogs in a box, and let the effluent just sit there and stink. Like that's not how, like we're like there is some community decision making about how we want to use the land and our responsibilities to each other as landowners. So it's like, yeah, you can move in and private property means you have the right to use this land for productive purposes and to make your living from it, but it's not sort of unlimited and it's not completely decontextualized from the neighborhood, from everyone else. And that fits really, that this is not something I was familiar with at all, but it makes, you bring up the idea of virtue and it automatically pulls for that, right? Like, it's like, then it's talking about, well, how do we treat the land? And anybody knows if you really like those places are gross. Nobody wants to live by those. Nobody wants to smell those. Like they're morally abhorrent. Just like you have to do a whole lot of weird mental gymnastics to think that this is an okay thing, right? But if you're there and you're living with your community and living with the consequences of that, like, and then you're forced to reckon with like the idea of virtue and like how you're treating other people and your neighbors who have to smell this shit. How you're treating the fish that this runs off into. Like you have to own what that means, right? And you have to own that, like, you know what? Kind of makes you a bad person. Your neighbors think you're a bad person. That's kind of awful. Instead of being able to like hide under these obscure layers of bureaucracy and this idea of profit and, well, it's just, it's this efficient, right? So just like, look out, like this is what the market wants me to do. Like you're able to hide in that, instead of like really owning. But no, I actually just want to exploit this land and everybody around it so that I can make money. So like, I just wanted to kind of take that and tie these examples together because it just occurred to me as like, well, that seems like exactly what we're talking about. Like just being neighborly, practicing virtue, working with, collaborating with the people around you and understanding that like, hey, we have to make this work together.
I really like that example, and that's a great concrete one of something that, yeah, like is, private property, may mean that you get you don't have to like plant certain things, because it's not like you're, fulfilling like the government quota or the community quota of stuff. Like you still have like that autonomy, but you're exactly right. Like that's an example where you're doing something that's first of all, doing real harm to the environment, to the community, to the commons, that exist in terms of like the streams and even just like, I mean, the air, the view, these things too are commons, right? And like making those decisions about how they're going to be regulated and used is important. And I think I think that's another good example in that, first off, in liberalism, in capitalism, right? Like profit is virtue, right? To make money is, to serve yourself and accumulate. I mean, there's a great line in Marx actually, where he says, accumulate, accumulate. This is Moses and the prophets, playing on a biblical phrase and pointing out like the morality of capitalism is precisely that. And so and that's something that's unnatural, right? Like we need more than we can't just like impose a law, like doing just land reform, and parceling out all the land isn't going to fix the problem that people still like. That's how most people relate to the world, is through the profit motive, certainly in the first world, right? In the West, in the consumerist West. And so like if you parceled out all the land, and you got a bunch of suburbanites, who were given their 3 acres and a cow, the first thing they're going to try to do, if they even somehow accept it in this kind of magical scenario, is to like find a way to turn a profit, as much as possible, and like restore the living condition that they had before, and et cetera. We need, but that's not to say like laws have a purpose; they have a role, and that's exactly what you were pointing out. Like the community, a local community, especially like that subsidiary government that is an actual personal relationship with the people that it governs, where there's real conversations and real skin in the game for everyone involved. That has a role in legislating and leading people to virtue, and in helping regulate the good life, the common good for people. But it also requires all of them as individuals to be wanting virtue, right? Like, to be living in that way and building them up. So it happens on both levels. And I think that kind of gets to the question of what you were asking earlier about like how we begin moving there. And I think it does take the politics. Like we need that kind of, local organizing, and especially local organizing, right? Like, having the national distributist party, which is like electing candidates. And there is actually in the US, the American Solidarity Party is like explicitly distributist. And, that's great. I'm involved with them and everything. But I'm most interested in their efforts, and they do actually make a lot of efforts specifically with like local candidates, like enabling people to win local offices, and trying to do that kind of community organizing, because that's really where things need to begin, both on and that's where we can begin, like on the individual level, how we live, changing our lifestyle habits, and building up communities that are doing that simultaneously, and then also sort of springboarding those into broader communities that are actually changing local governance and local policies, local institutions. And then, once that's all done, then I guess we could talk about a network of all these different kind of local networks, connecting with each other, binding together to, kind of ensure a broader, kind of vision and horizon and world. But, focusing on that first is that kind of modernist mindset. Like none of that other basic stuff exists. And that's, which we have a very urgent need to create those sorts of people, right? Like, because again, we need the personal, people who are committed in these various ways to an ecological conversion in many senses, and then also, those local sort of movements and institutions.
Chris, did you have a response too?
Yeah, I mean, quite complementary to what Sean was just saying, I think, but in a way, trying to link some of the things that the three of you were just saying previously. So, Ashley, you mentioned the sort of the way that we forget how cheap energy, kind of makes the world go round, and that sort of has knock-on implications in terms of material flows and cheap money, ultimately. And so you were talking about how people say, oh, this kind of agrarian world, it sounds like it's going to be a lot of hard work. Well, yeah, it kind of is a lot of hard work. But what we forget is that there's an awful lot of hard work that people are doing, in other parts of the world, in kind of rich countries like the US or the UK, within those countries too, but even more so in other parts of the world. There's a hell of a lot of hard work that people are doing that sustains, we sort of think, oh, it's great modern life, and we kind of have this conceit that, well, those other parts of the world are not as developed as us. And, one reason they're not as developed is because of a whole kind of colonial history. But, we've been able to have this mindset in over the last 100 plus whatever years that those places are going to catch up, and, ultimately we'll all be wealthy. But, I think the place we are now in global history is the end of that illusion, and that links, I think, to Sean's point about justice, the virtue of justice, having proportionate relationships with other people. And so, if we really sort of take that on board, that means, not essentially drawing, extractively drawing from people in other parts of the world. And that, of course, is part of, one of the problems. If you go to a store, buy stuff, you've got no idea where it came from, the energy that was embodied in it, the labor conditions. And then that relates to Nate's point about the big pig unit. I mean, that is totally based on the only way we can have these units is through cheap energy, cheap commodity food production that's kind of implicitly and explicitly subsidized through fossil energy, through government subsidies, and through the that whole kind of over-connected world. And so that's what we need to transcend, but it's hard to transcend. I mean, there's a great book I was talk about in my own book about sort of early Appalachia, Stephen Stoll's book, Ramp Hollow, where kind of he talks about the Whiskey Rebellion and the way that the sort of mountaineers in Appalachia saw off Hamilton and his kind of attempt to impose a whiskey tax, because they were well grounded in their locality. They were quite militarized, knew how to handle a gun and so on. What they didn't know how to handle was how to stop the big coal companies coming in and kind of just blowing open the mountaintops. And our kind of the parallel is that concentrated pig unit example. And I think we have to. I mean, one of the great things about distributism, I think, is you can get this slightly sort of NIMBY type of organization. Well, we don't want that big pig unit, and we're happy if it's somewhere else, and we're happy to buy cheap pork. But we don't want it here. What the great thing about the distributist thing is that, yes, it's like, we do have to come together as a community and stop this kind of thing. And to some extent, the energy dynamics and the capital flows are gonna stop it anyway, and the dealing with the waste and so on. But there's also a positive side to that, which is, okay, if we don't want this big pig unit, what do we want? Well, we want local pork that can be raised by the farmer, in a more sustainable way. Pigs are great at processing, waste food and sort of generating fat. And we're not really there, as I forget, I can't remember who said it, but that is the problem, that we haven't really. We've lost a lot of that kind of sense of local economic autonomy and local citizenship. And I think, it's kind of hard local work along the lines Sean was saying to sort of regenerate that. But that's the kind of, that's the direction we have to go in, and actually start sort of thinking, well, we can generate livelihoods, we can generate what we need locally, and it's not, I'm not saying it's not hard work, and I'm not saying that there aren't endless problems and difficulties as we go down this path, but it's not altogether, it's not a trail of tears. There is a positive aspect about generating, generating a true renewable local economy that gives people livelihood and gives people sort of local goods and local meaning.
Yeah, least bad outcome. Go ahead, Sean.
Well, we could go more or less into this, but I think on the topic of like the sort of like, what do the politics of distributism look like, aside from just promoting the ideas and everything. And I think the whole degrowth world, I think, is really, unfortunately, there's not enough like conversation there as there should be, because a lot of degrowth originally too was very focused on like the national kind of stuff of like, oh, like we need to sort of implement a national policy of degrowth. And it's obviously pretty clear, especially after all like the climate conferences and everything, that that's simply impossible. Like not only is there no political will, it also, like, the thing that makes nation states work is growth. You know what I mean? So that's not really a viable, the nation state is not a viable vessel for that. But local communities, on the other hand, I think are extremely ripe for that. I think degrowth literature, I've seen some of it, and a lot of it has come too from like the socialist kind of camp. And so I don't think it's been as attentive to some of the importance, and not all of it, but like the distributist kind of discourse and everything. But I think that, linking those discourses up, I think, are really important, because a lot of distributists, they can be focused on very much the moral and aesthetic and like personal, good of living locally, consuming locally, etc. Degrowth, I think, is really focused on a lot of the stuff Chris was saying, like the injustice and violence of these large scale, like analyzing how these large scale chemical, just food inputs, all these sorts of things affect different people and their quality of life. And so I think that there's a real room for a politics that connects those things, like connects the distributist vision of that this is, a virtuous, good, life of dignified work and community and family and etc. While also, recognizing like it is that all these good things are being violently, continually broken down further and further. And that gives us kind of a clear, like that vision gives us like what we want to move towards, and also what we want to clearly resist. Because I think so much one thing that degrowth thinkers talk about is relocalization or decoupling, and decoupling in the localist sense, not in like the U.S. China sense. And so what that means is trying to recognize the way that our local economies, you used the word of colonization earlier, you know what I mean, in terms of that land is truly colonized by that, giant mega farming mindset and technology. That's something that can be organized around politically. You know what I mean? If you have a local community that, and you see this even like when warehouses are going up in a small town, you'll almost always, there'll be some degree of resistance because people recognize like something bad's happening here, but they don't have the political imagination and mindset to attach it to the catastrophic issues of our time. It's mostly an aesthetic thing, like, oh, that's going to be ugly, and that's true, it will be ugly, but it's also going to contribute to the destruction of the world, and that's a politics that I think, like, that connection, once that's made, I think opens up so many potentials for local communities to say, what ways can we essentially detach our whole, both city and city in the small sense. I'm here in Lancaster city, population around 60,000. And I think it's kind of the upward limits of what a city can be before it turns into something that can only be capitalist. And so, how do you have like, small cities, towns, and then their surrounding countryside, uniting those things in economies that are serving one another while resisting the colonization, the sort of entrance of capitalist growth and new corporations coming in, protests against those sorts of things, whether it's Amazon trucks or a new warehouse or a new, mining venture, all these sorts of things like our sites. And there's no one, like, I can't say there's one solution, but these all can be sites of resistance. And then in that resistance, you're always going to be asked the question, well, what do you want instead? What's the alternative? And that's where you can answer with that positive vision of a local economy based on these distributed principles.
I have Nate, do you have something quick? Because I have something I've been waiting to say relative to these guys.
I did have a thought, but go ahead.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I'll go and then you go. Okay, so this whole time I've been thinking, and I'm just going to bring it back to what I said before, like there is something like in political philosophy classes in college, let's just say, where everyone's like, in a perfect world, we'll have this, and like this is the way things ought to be, and blah, blah, and we're all just like theorizing about what ought to be. But I think it's just worth explicitly saying, again, we have real historical material limits. And those ones are like matching up with not just what ought to be, but what will be in the world. Like we are going to have less energy. And if you have less energy, you're not just going to be like freely shipping stuff all over the world. Or, there's little breakdowns of these very high energy, highly industrial processes. And to me, I just think it's really, really worth thinking. It's not just about like, yeah, in the ideal situation, we should all be virtuous and localist, but instead like be in a constant dance with the historical like material world. Like these things are breaking down, and as they do, you jump in there with like, here's an alternative to this, basically starving or whatever, not being able to get stuff. This is an alternative to this. This is why it is virtuous. This is how it works, and like building up those skills. And I want to just briefly say, here in Uruguay, at least in the circles that I run in, there's just a very strong, like we're all in it together mentality. And I really, connect with a lot of people who are super environmentalist. And I went to this event where this guy came and talked about like an industrial pig operation. And at the event, people were like shaming him, like, and it was like, this is like morally wrong, and it was like, it was so cool to be in that situation. Some of them I think were like a little bit too rude, but the guy was like, shocked by it. He was like a Dutch business guy, talking to these Uruguayans about like this. He kept calling them animal units and stuff. And people were like, this is horrible. He's like, Uruguay is a great place for for investing because we have this huge aquifer that we can exploit. And somebody yelled out like, yeah, that you're gonna like poison and pollute. And it was like, that really felt so cool. And just like just to describe in detail like what that politics feels like in reality, like there is a morality, people know what it is. And I think there just needs to be more of us like just calling it out and saying, and not just, I think with the degrowth thing, like not just a negative vision, not just don't fly, but like, why is this good? You know, what's good about it? What's virtuous about it? You can tell when something's virtuous. People know, you know, and I think it's really important to both point out the virtue, but also point out like this thing is a historical material reality. It's breaking down, and in its place, here's this virtuous thing. You know, it's like it's a 1-2 punch. Nate, sorry, go ahead.
No,
I love that. I wish I could be there cheering on.
I know.
The pig entrepreneur.
That is a wonderful, you know, and as you're talking, it's just this conversation thing that is coming up for me, that has been coming up for me a lot for a while, but like, it's really just, you know, it's just how fully and completely colonized our minds are by a capitalist viewpoint. It's like so hard to see the world in any other way. Like it just goes so deep into just the basic you know, understanding of who, you know, I am, who a person is in relation to other people and in relation to the world. Like it goes really, really deep, which is why I think it makes sense a lot. And that's why I think that so many people that I'm sure that are listening to this podcast and that seem to be drawn to this, you know, focus a lot on food, because I think it's such a tangible way to start and to understand this. And it is interesting. One of the, you know, one thing we observe periodically is the recoiling of a lot of people from just the idea of farming, or the idea of like this is like a visceral like revulsion at it. Which is, I mean, it's sad. It's also kind of hilarious. Like, yeah, you know, like we're organisms that have lived on the planet for millions of years. But yeah, we solved food. We solved it. Like we don't have to think about food. Like I don't want to go think about food. Like we solved that problem. Like the basics of like continuing to live by consuming food. Yeah, we solved it. Like you can't go backwards and like have to think about food again. Like it's like really like no, like a hard no. And I think then this gets into we're so, you know, view the world and see things through this capitalist lens so much. It's like, well, if I have to worry about food, I don't want to have to worry about food, because we have so many things we have to worry about, because we're so insecure about so many different things. But how am I going to make my health insurance premium every month? And how am I going to, you know, keep the bills paid? I got to worry about taxes. And I got to worry about, so like we're constantly worried and insecure about, you know, these financial obligations and whatnot. And then it's like food, that's another thing to worry about. And so, you know, it makes me think like in this, like you know, if you're thinking about just being like a self-contained locality, like that sort of, this thought came to me, talking about like 3 acres and a cow. And well, how do I turn that into money? Because I have to turn that into money because I have to pay my premium. I have to do this, right? Like, so you don't think in terms of like food, nourishment. Okay, well, that's a solvable problem that I can do something about. I can learn from this land. I can actually do something with it, right? Like I can make food that I can sustain myself with. It's this abstraction of like, well, I got this bill and that bill and this bill and that bill. And food to other people just feels like yet another abstraction that I don't want it. Like that's too much. And so it's like this need to simplify the things that we can tangibly do and think about. But also then how do we support those other needs that are still there? Like in that framework, it's like, well, we still have to, you know, people still want to see the doctor if they're sick, you know, and like, there's just all these interlocking problems that I think the scale of which seems so tremendously overwhelming that like, if you pull on one little thing, it brings up all the other ones. And then the fear and the insecurity come up so powerfully that it just stops. I think it shuts people down. It's like, well, no. There's just no way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I totally hear that.
Yeah. I don't know if you have a solution, but that's definitely a thing. Like it's just everything's so interconnected. There's almost like sometimes this pushback where I I literally will say something like, try planting a potato, and people are like, well, that doesn't solve climate change. It's like, yeah, of course that one potato doesn't, you know what I mean? They want to just solve it all at once, but there is no real solve it all at once thing.
There's not, but I think that that's such a like it because it ties into that fear. I think that's what like it directly pulls on fear. It makes it like, if is that another thing I like. And so there's that fear seems like such a tremendous barrier to, you know, helping people think outside of this capitalist mindset that we all have really deeply. And so like, how do we work with that fear, I guess?
Yeah,
Chris, I guess that's the question I would ask. I'm a therapist, right?
Yeah, you're the therapist. I was just going to say that. Yeah. Chris, go ahead.
No, well, I agree with that, and I think that sort of metaphor of the string, you know, everything relates to everything else in these like really intractable ways, but that's one of the arguments I think we have to make, that so many of the sort of like the, you know, I've got a brilliant plan to fix this all, you know, a lot of it sort of reverts to this notion that somehow we're going to get clean, you know, that cheap, clean energy is going to be available and that will solve everything. And I think, you know, on the one hand, I'm very skeptical about the notion that we will have as abundant and as cheap energy as we've been accustomed to with fossil fuels. But also there's a whole bunch of other issues. I mean, climate is one, water is a really huge issue, soil issues, and sort of political economic ones. So these things are all kind of happening in real time. And as you say, Nate, that's leading to, you know, there's a certain amount of, I can't cope with it all. And, you know, people have got enough on their plates. But on the other hand, there is I think the sort of planting the potato thing is really critical. And also kind of a different narrative about food, because I think, you know, one reason why people sort of reject farming is not because they're not interested in food or nature, because actually I think there's this huge thirst to connect with nature, to grow things. I mean, we have a whole bunch of different people coming through our little holding here who it really transforms them actually just to you know, be amongst the trees and the birds and the insects, but also to be, you know, growing food. You know, partly it's a kind of social, it connects to what we were talking about earlier, this notion of progress, and it connects to, you know, maybe a historical memory of kind of agrarian oppression, you know, that you're you know, that you're a small farmer, you're a peasant under the thumb of you know, the feudal lord or whatever. But I mean, that's the reality of many people today. I mean, you know, small scale, you know, tropical, you know, coffee farmers or tropical fruit farmers, you know, in many countries, you know, they can't afford to eat what they produce. You know, global commodity prices make the difference between, you know, whether they can buy clothes for their children, you know. So again, it's about, you know, taking responsibility for this. But my feeling is that it is changing a little bit, and think, you know, things like COVID, you know, here the supermarkets pretty quickly emptied of fresh fruit and vegetables. And by the way, that's another thing that probably needs to be in this conversation, that when we talk about the successors of modern farming, it's very geared on a small number of commodity crops, you know, like 75% of global cropland. You know, it's exactly what you were talking about. It's, you know, 6 cereals, soy, beans, canola. You know, there's a very small number of crops which dominate global agriculture. And generally, you know, the reason we grow them so much is because they do a lot of good things. But, you know, you can have too much of a good thing, and, you know, we need more. You know, we need more diversity. We need more fresh fruit and veg, and that, again, that's what, you know, here in the UK and possibly the US is a bit different. But, you know, basically we rely either on importing this stuff from other countries or on importing cheap labor to provide it for us. And, you know, that's not a viable long-term strategy. But, you know, with COVID, with the supermarket shelves suddenly emptying, you know, we had, you know, we normally get maybe 1 or 2 new customer requests for our little veg boxes a week. Suddenly we had about 200, you know, and now that's all kind of faded a little bit. But, you know, these things are sort of incremental. There's more interest among young people in, you know, agriculture as a career. There's more interest in food from an environmental point of view. You know, when I was a kid, like the idea of growing, you know, sort of leaving school and starting to grow your own vegetables as a way of life was, you know, was sort of insane. Whereas it isn't now really so much. You know, a lot of young people that pass through our holding and go on to do things. So I think, you know, I totally agree with your point about people just, you know, food, you know, there is that sense that it's something that's been solved, but increasingly I think there's an awareness that it hasn't, and you can almost flip that in terms of people feeling, you know, disconnected from nature. And I think the key thing is for it not just to be about nature, you know, like going to the mountains, going to a national park. You know, nature means you know, your soil in your backyard, you know, growing those potatoes and you know, not growing everything, but certainly, you know, I think we need to break down that distinction between farmers or professional growers and amateurs. You know, whatever, you know, if you grow one potato, that's one less potato to buy in the shop, and that's one more little bit of economic autonomy, and you can, you know, you can build that up in, you know, in any number of ways. But you know, these are all the things that are sort of beginning to happen, because I think, you know, we're going to have, as Ashley was saying, we're going to have this future one way or another. It could be a bad future, it could be a good future, and that, you know, and we've got to kind of, you know, accentuate those kind of positive possibilities.
Yeah, and I would just
nature is barn swallows. Nature is barn swallows. I just want to say that.
Yeah. And just like the incrementalism is so huge. Like I think I think it must be a modern mindset, but people think you have to solve global problems through some sort of global top-down policy, as if that's always worked well, some sort of top-down policy. I just think like, yeah, and first of all, not only would that not work well, it would never happen politically. Like you just a few climate protesters going to go up against like the strongest, most energy dense, like, you know, network of leaders in history, like, you know. But I do think incrementally changing is huge, and incremental amounts of sovereignty on the smallest scale possible is great. I want to ask, I know it's getting late for Chris. I want to just bring up one other thing that I think is so cool, and I think it's really exciting, and maybe Sean can talk about it. So I don't know whether or not we're gonna like formally announce anything about the organizing we've been doing behind the scenes, and you can make that decision after I ask this question, Sean. But I want to point out that there is, can you guys hear me? Testing, 1, 2, 3. Did I go away? Testing, 1, 2, 3. Am I here? Testing. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing. Am I back yet? I know I was gone for a second. Am I back?
I think you're back.
Okay.
Maybe not.
Testing. You let me know when I'm back. We can cut out this part.
You kind of.
Darn it. Testing. Am I back? Testing, 1, 2, 3. Am I here? Can you hear me? Testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me again? Can you hear me yet? Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing. Anybody can hear me? Darn it. Testing. Can you hear me? Oh, can you hear me? I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah,
my back. Oh my gosh. Okay. And I think Zoom will keep this. It happened on my interview with Malcolm too, so for on the voluntary property thing. So we'll just cut that part out. I'll restart this question. So okay, so I want to bring up one other thing about something that we've been working on behind the scenes, and I'll let Sean decide whether or not he wants to mention what the thing is that we're working on behind the scenes. But briefly, I just want to lay out that like people who are sort of overlapping in some ways with the distributist ideology include people like International Peasants Movement, people from the Global South, Third World Liberation movements, worker cooperatives, regenerative ag people, back to the land people, self-sufficiency people, degrowth, Luddites, indigenous movements, plain people of religious communities, sort of like the Occupy Wall Street, Jubilee movements, new urbanists, virtue ethics, and then climate and environmental movements. I think it's worth saying that out loud because there are just a lot of people working on things that are so similar to this that I think just need like a thread to see how we're all in this similar fight together. And so I don't know, I'll let Sean elaborate whatever he wants to say about that.
Yeah, definitely. No, and I think that list of different ideas is yeah, obviously, yeah, something we've been discussing. Of like, there's so many of the ideas we've discussed here are being discussed in so many different places by people who don't necessarily know each other. Like they might be in touch with one or two different discourses, but yeah, there's just so much good dialogue and discussion going on. But it does feel like, and I think gets to something we were talking about earlier, like the urgency. We really need creative thinking. We need a sort of renewal of political philosophy in this sort of time and place that we're in, and we need it really quick. Like we don't exactly have like a ton of time to sit around in coffee houses and do a really long form enlightenment. And so I think an idea that we've been discussing, and I'll sort of maybe not give the exact plan and details, but something that's in the works is like Chris mentioned earlier, having a distributist congress, a meeting, likely an in-person meeting of a lot of these people from these different discourses. And there's a lot of great writers and thinkers, activists, and I mean that not just in like the political activism, but people who are just homesteading, who are living out, are leading in terms of practicing going back to the land and doing it well and virtuously. So putting a lot of these different people in conversation that Ashley, you just mentioned, is the real goal here, and especially getting distributism out there as something that can be a uniting political philosophy and theory for so many different people. So I think if people are interested in being involved in that, then I would encourage them to reach out to any one of us. Tradistae is my website. You can there's a contact page there, and I'm sure people can find Ashley, your stuff and reach out. And likewise, Chris is at A Small Farm Future, and encourage people to be checking that out. And whether people have seen any one of those three. Yeah, I think that there's so many points of entry, and there's no need to, and maybe just to answer very explicitly to the question earlier, I saw on the Twitter, distributism definitely does not need to be, if one is an agnostic or, is whatever else, not Christian or whatever. Definitely, I think, if you're a Christian, you have to be a distributist, frankly, you know what I mean? Like if you're really going to be, in line with the gospel. But if you're not, then there's so many different points of entry, whether it's from the climate angle or the, the justice angle, or just, the good food angle. There's so many sort of just natural human things that pull us towards thinking in this way. And so wherever people are coming from, I encourage them to reach out, because we definitely, we're looking to begin sort of organizing this conversation, this event, and it'll take some volunteers, some people to help us do some of the heavy lifting of that organizing. And so, yeah, we just encourage people to reach out if they're interested in specifically getting involved and they're inspired by these ideas.
Awesome. Any final thoughts, Nate or Chris?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly to on the back of that, I mean, it's sort of like this whole discussion we've sort of come around at various times, like Nate's example of the pig unit, or the example of kind of overly centralized bureaucratic state control and the power of the center, and various other examples. But like that list that you read out, and all the different people and movements that Sean was talking about, they're kind of all people that in one way or another are trying to build some autonomy from that, and people who sort of have some kind of critique of these bigger systemic forces, but also have some kind of practice that they're trying to develop, some kind of practical action that's actually in whatever way they see best, trying to implement something different. And that's, in a sense, the key divide between those big abstract aggregating forces and people who've got, who are building an autonomy and who have an alternative practice. So, just to underline Sean's point, the more that we, these people, and inherently it's going to be local and specific, but there's can have lines. So distributism right to that, building local, building autonomy, having a practice and working together, so absolutely, it seems to me a great time and an important movement right now.
Yeah.
Maybe go ahead, Nathan.
Oh, I was just gonna go ahead. I was just gonna say something to conclude my part, but go ahead.
Sure. Well, I just want to make a brief note of that, just on what Chris was saying as an umbrella. It can be easy to kind of say, distributism as an ideology and stuff, which in my more sort of me moments, I might do. But I think I maybe want to just note that I think that distributism is something that genuinely does escape what we've come to call ideology. Just in that, and I think just even the fact of what we're talking about speaks to that, because it's not something that begins in this kind of totally abstracted from reality theory and then needs to be implemented violently on the world, which is what so much of what modernity is. Rather, it really belongs in this realm of something classical, of political theory, political philosophy, or of this kind of umbrella in a very subsidiary sense of so many practices that in many ways are just trying to do, like new urbanism is trying to do, just good traditional human-centered cities that are about people and not cars and skyscrapers and such. That's one way of that's a part of what a distributed society would look like, but it's not all of it, right? Like all of them, all of the good agriculture or justice in terms of indigenous and third world peoples and stuff, like all of these seemingly disconnected are all kind of part of that. And so it's really a part of subsidiarity that there's a, on their own, they have not been able to kind of coalesce and address these things without falling into the ideologies that are out there. And so I think distributism is very much this political philosophy that can be like the next subsidiary level up of a way of all these real and genuine practices that don't need to be overrided or conform to it, but can share in this general kind of consensus and common goal and common good. So just wanted to note that of maybe just something that distinguishes it from yet another, ideology or something.
That's lovely. And I know, actually just trying to wrap up. I'm like, well, you just opened up the ideology rabbit hole. I mean, come on.
Right at the end.
But it is beautiful. And that's what I mean, I'm super grateful to be able to have this conversation. And that's what we're talking about. We talk about the antidote in some ways to this insecurity and fear that this isolation of capitalism, that mindset brings us. It happens in relationship with other people. It happens in our bodies. It happens in a place. It happens in doing work you can see with your hands that measurably, like you can see it. Like it happens by, right here and now through engagement. And that's what this seems like it's talking about. It isn't, and it's not abstract in that way. And so that feels very exciting to me. I often say ideology poisons everything, because that's what seems to be the case. No matter what the best intentions, ideology seems to poison everything. So, I'm very drawn to that aspect that seems to be a bit ideology proof. Just really grateful for this conversation and grateful to be given the opportunity to be here and co-host. And it's been wonderful to chat with all of you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah.
It's been great. Thanks so much for
being patient.
having me on.
Yep.
Yeah, no, it's been really good. There's so many further